Vegetable oil. Not cigarettes, not alcohol. Vegetable oil is what's getting poured down sinks on camera right now by people convinced it's poison. You've probably cooked with it this week. And the actual peer-reviewed research on it says almost the exact opposite of what they're claiming.
So today we're putting this claim on trial. Not vibes, not a guy in a podcast full of tales, like one of them is a weapon. Like the evidence, study by study.
By the end of this video, you'll know exactly why this fear went viral, which parts of it have a real scientific kernel, and which parts completely fall apart the moment you check them against the data.
So in this video, we're going to do exactly what we did with cancer myths. We're going to lay out what seed oils actually are, where this fear actually came from,
and then we're going to hold that argument up against the actual research, study by study, point by point. Not vibes, not anecdotes, not a guy on a podcast. The actual evidence. And just like before, a quick note on what this video is and isn't.
This is general nutrition science, the kind that applies across large populations over time. It isn't personalized medical condition, a specific allergy,
or a doctor who has given you specific dietary guidance. That conversation takes priority over anything in this video.
What this video can do is give you a much clearer picture of where the actual scientific consensus sits on one of the most heavily debated topics in nutrition right now.
Let's start with the basics. What is a seed oil, actually? Seed oils are exactly what they sound like. Oils extracted from the seeds of plants rather than from fruits like olives or avocados. The most common ones you'll see on a label are soybean oil, corn oil, canola oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, cottonseed oil, and grapeseed oil. They became popular for a few very practical reasons. They're relatively cheap to produce at scale, they have a neutral flavor that doesn't compete with other ingredients, and many of them have a fairly high smoke point, meaning they can be heated to a reasonably high temperature before they start to break down, which makes them useful for frying and high-heat cooking. Chemically, what actually defines a seed oil is its fatty acid profile. Most seed oils are high in polyunsaturated fat, and within that category, they're particularly high in one specific fatty acid called linoleic acid, which is an omega-6 fat. Your body can't make linoleic acid on its own, which is why it's classified as an essential fatty acid, meaning you have to get it from food. Small amounts are necessary for normal cell function, skin health, and several other processes. That single fact, that seed oils are mainly defined by being high in linoleic acid, is going to be the center of almost everything we talk about for the rest of this video, because the entire case against seed oils is built on what happens when humans eat a lot of linoleic acid. So let's get into where that argument actually came from. To understand the current backlash, you have to go back about 70 years. In the 1950s and 60s, heart disease was rising sharply across wealthy countries, and a lot of nutrition science at the time pointed towards saturated fat, the kind found heavily in butter, lard, and red meat, as a major driver of high cholesterol and cardiovascular disease. Public health guidance shifted accordingly, encouraging people to replace saturated fats with unsaturated fats, including the polyunsaturated fats found in seed oils. Vegetable oil consumption increased dramatically over the following decades, partly through direct cooking oil use and partly because seed oils became extremely common ingredients in packaged and processed foods, since they're cheap, shelf-stable, and neutral-tasting. For a long time, that guidance wasn't seriously challenged in mainstream nutrition circles. But starting roughly in the last decade, and accelerating heavily in just the last few years, a counter-narrative built up real momentum, mostly online rather than in academic journals. The core of that counter-narrative goes something like this. Seed oils are a modern, industrial invention. Humans didn't evolve eating them. They require heavy processing to extract, and the dramatic rise in chronic disease over the last several decades happened at the same time seed oil consumption rose. Therefore, the argument goes, seed oils are a hidden driver of the chronic disease epidemic, disguised as a heart-healthy food. This narrative has picked up serious cultural momentum recently, partly tied to a broader wellness and Make America Healthy Again movement that specifically targeted seed oils, alongside food dyes and ultra-processed food in general, as a primary villain in the modern diet. It's a compelling story, it has a clear bad guy, and it taps into a very understandable instinct that something this common and this processed must be doing harm. But a compelling story and a scientifically supported conclusion are two different things, and that gap is exactly what we need to look at carefully. So let's break down the actual biological argument piece by piece, because there is a real mechanism being described here. It's just a question of whether that mechanism plays out the way the claim suggests once you actually test it in humans. The central biochemical claim goes like this. Linoleic acid, the omega-6 fat that seed oils are loaded with, can be converted in the body into a different fatty acid called arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid is a precursor to a group of signaling molecules called eicosanoids, some of which do play a role in promoting inflammation in the body. So the chain of logic is more seed oil, more linoleic acid, more arachidonic acid, more inflammatory signaling molecules, more chronic inflammation, more chronic disease. That pathway is real. It does exist biochemically. The question is whether eating typical amounts of seed oil actually drives that pathway hard enough to matter. And this is where the popular claim and the actual research start to diverge sharply.
Multiple studies that have directly measured this conversion process in humans have found that only a very small fraction of dietary linoleic acid,
generally estimated around 0.2%, actually gets converted into arachidonic acid. Your body tightly regulates this conversion through a controlled set of enzymes, and it doesn't simply scale up in proportion to how much linoleic acid you eat. Researchers have specifically tested this by dramatically increasing dietary linoleic acid intake, in some studies by several 100%, and found that arachidonic acid levels in the blood did not rise in proportion. The regulatory system essentially holds the line. That alone substantially undercuts the core mechanism. But let's go a step further, because the real question isn't just whether the chemical conversion happens, it's whether eating more seed oil actually raises measurable inflammation in real people. And this has been tested directly, repeatedly, using actual inflammatory biomarkers in blood, things like C-reactive protein, and various inflammatory cytokines that researchers use specifically to measure inflammation in the body. The pattern across this research is remarkably consistent, and it cuts directly against the popular claim. A systematic review pooling results from over a dozen randomized controlled trials in healthy humans found no significant evidence that dietary linoleic acid increases inflammatory markers. More recent research has gone further. A large study published in 2025, involving close to 3,000 people, measured linoleic acid levels directly in the blood rather than relying on self-reported diet surveys, which makes the data considerably more reliable, and found no connection between blood linoleic acid levels and inflammation markers at all. Another large study from the same period, looking at nearly 1,900 people using direct blood biomarkers, found that higher linoleic acid levels were actually associated with lower inflammation and better cardiometabolic health, not worse. So at this point we have two separate claims that both need to hold up for the seed oil fear to make biochemical sense, and both of them have failed to hold up under direct testing. The conversion from linoleic acid to arachidonic acid is minimal and tightly regulated, and higher linoleic acid intake doesn't track with higher inflammation in actual human bodies. If anything, the data points in the opposite direction. Now, let's talk about heart disease specifically, because this is where the evidence is arguably strongest, and it's been built up over decades through one of the most heavily studied questions in all of nutrition science. What happens when you replace saturated fat with the polyunsaturated fat found in seed oils? This has been tested in large randomized controlled trials, which are the gold standard for this kind of question because they can establish cause and effect rather than just correlation. The consistent finding across this body of research is that replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, including the linoleic acid found in seed oils, reduces LDL cholesterol, often called the bad cholesterol, and is associated with a meaningfully lower risk of cardiovascular events. This isn't a single study or a fringe finding. It's one of the more robust, repeated conclusions in cardiovascular nutrition research, and it's part of why major health organizations have continued to recommend unsaturated fats, including seed oils, as a replacement for saturated fat sources. There's also a large body of observational research tracking linoleic acid levels in the blood against long-term health outcomes across tens of thousands of people in multiple countries. One frequently cited pooled analysis, combining data from roughly 30 separate studies and nearly 70,000 people, found that higher circulating linoleic acid was associated with a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, lower risk of stroke, and lower all-cause mortality, meaning a lower risk of death from any cause during the study period. Separate research has also linked higher linoleic acid levels to a meaningfully lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes, with one study finding that people with the highest linoleic acid levels had about a 35% lower risk of developing diabetes compared to people with the lowest levels. I want to pause on that for a second because it's worth sitting with how directly this contradicts the popular narrative. The claim online is that seed oils are quietly driving the chronic disease epidemic. The actual measured biomarker data, in large studies, repeatedly shows the opposite pattern, that higher levels of the specific fat found in seed oils are associated with better metabolic and cardiovascular outcomes, not worse ones.
So why does the myth feel so intuitively convincing if the direct evidence doesn't support it? A few reasons, and they're worth understanding.
Because they apply to a lot of nutrition misinformation beyond just this one topic. The first reason is confounding. Seed oils are extremely common ingredients in ultra-processed foods, things like packaged snacks, fast food, fried food, and pre-made meals. People who eat a lot of these products also tend to eat fewer vegetables, less fiber, less protein from whole food sources, and significantly more refined carbohydrates and added sugar, all at the same time. When researchers see that heavy consumers of ultra-processed food have worse health outcomes, which they consistently do, it's extremely easy to point at one ingredient that shows up in almost all of those products, in this case seed oil, and assume that ingredient is the cause. But the seed oil isn't the only thing that changed in that person's diet. It's correlated with dozens of other dietary and lifestyle factors that are much harder to isolate and that have plenty of their own well-established links to poor health, particularly the overall pattern of eating heavily processed food low in fiber and high in refined carbohydrates. Blaming the oil specifically requires actually isolating it from everything else going on in that dietary pattern, and when researchers do isolate it, using controlled trials and direct biomarkers the way we just walked through, the oil itself doesn't show the harm. The second reason is the appeal of a single villain. Seed oils are secretly poisoning everyone is a much more shareable, much more emotionally satisfying explanation than chronic disease results from a complicated mix of total caloric intake, overall dietary pattern, physical activity, sleep, genetics, and socioeconomic factors that interact in ways that are hard to summarize in a 15-second video. Simple, dramatic explanations spread faster than accurate, complicated ones, on basically every platform, every time. This isn't a new pattern. It's the same dynamic that's driven plenty of nutrition fads before this one. The third reason is the appeal to nature. The argument that seed oils are unnatural because they require industrial processing to extract carries real emotional weight, even though it requires processing and, harmful to humans, aren't actually the same thing. Olive oil also requires processing, just a different kind. Plenty of things that occur in nature are harmful, and plenty of things that require manufacturing are perfectly safe or even beneficial. The naturalness of a food's origin doesn't tell you much on its own about what it does inside your body, and treating it as if it does is a logical shortcut, not a scientific argument.
Now, I do want to be fair to the other side of this conversation because there are a couple of points in the seed oil skepticism that have at least some legitimate grounding.
Even if the strongest version of the claim doesn't hold up. It's worth separating those out clearly, because not every concern raised in this debate is equally weak. The first legitimate point is about oxidation from cooking practices, specifically. When any oil, including seed oils, is heated to high temperatures repeatedly and reused over long periods, which is common in commercial deep frying, it can break down and produce harmful oxidation byproducts, including compounds like aldehydes that have been linked to negative health effects with heavy, repeated exposure. This is a real phenomenon, but it's important to be precise about what it actually describes. It's a concern about how an oil is used, specifically prolonged high-heat reuse in deep frying, not a property of the unheated oil sitting in your pantry, or used for normal home cooking like sautéing vegetables or baking. A bottle of canola oil used a handful of times for cooking dinner at home is not chemically equivalent to the same oil used continuously in an industrial fryer over many hours across many days. This distinction gets collapsed constantly in online claims, where seed oils break down when abused at high heat for extended periods becomes seed oils are dangerous, which isn't a fair translation of the underlying research. The second legitimate point involves the ratio between omega-6 and omega 3 fatty acids in modern diets. Some researchers have pointed out that this ratio has shifted substantially over the last several decades, from something closer to 1-to-1 in historical diets to 10-to-1 or higher in many modern Western diets, largely because omega-6 intake has risen while omega-3 intake, found in foods like fatty fish, walnuts, and flaxseed, has not kept pace. Omega-3 fats have well-documented anti-inflammatory properties, and there's reasonable scientific interest in whether the specific ratio between these two fat types matters independently of the absolute amount of either one. Here's the important nuance, though. There currently isn't a clear, agreed-upon ideal ratio established by the research, and the strongest, most direct evidence we have, the kind using actual blood biomarkers in large human studies, does not show that higher omega-6 intake on its own drives inflammation, even at the higher ratios common in modern diets. So this remains a genuinely open area of nutrition science worth continued research, but it does not currently support the conclusion that seed oils themselves are actively harmful. It supports a different, much more modest conclusion, that it's probably worth making sure you're getting enough omega-3 fat in your diet, independent of how much omega-6 you're eating. The third point worth addressing directly is the processing concern itself, specifically around extraction methods. Many seed oils are extracted using a solvent called hexane, which sounds alarming when you hear it described as an industrial chemical being used to pull oil out of a seed. But the actual relevant question is how much hexane residue, if any, remains in the final product that ends up in your food, and whether that level poses a measurable health risk. Food safety regulations specifically limit and monitor residual solvent levels in the finished oil, and the trace amounts that can remain after refining are regulated specifically because of this kind of processing. The existence of an industrial extraction step doesn't, on its own, tell you anything about the safety of the finished product, any more than the industrial process used to pasteurize milk tells you milk is dangerous. If you want to evaluate processing safety, you have to look at what's actually measured in the final product against established safety thresholds, not just how alarming the extraction method sounds when described out of context. So if we pull all of this together, where does that leave us? The core claim driving the seed oil panic, that linoleic acid converts into meaningful amounts of arachidonic acid and drives chronic inflammation throughout the body, does not hold up against direct human research. The conversion rate is small and tightly regulated, and large studies using actual blood biomarkers consistently fail to find a connection between linoleic acid and inflammation, with some research pointing the opposite direction entirely. The claim that seed oils drive cardiovascular disease also runs directly against decades of randomized trial evidence showing that replacing saturated fat with the polyunsaturated fat found in seed oils lowers cardiovascular risk, and against large population studies linking higher linoleic acid levels to lower rates of heart disease, stroke, and type 2 diabetes.
If you take one thing away from this video, I'd want it to be this. The most viral nutrition claims are almost never the ones with the strongest evidence behind them. If this kind of breakdown is useful to you, this is exactly the kind of content this channel is going to keep doing. Like and subscribe for more.